And folks, on today, and one testing. And on today's podcast, folks, I thought I would include the bloopers that happened. What? Test. And on today's podcast, folks, I thought I would include the bloopers that developed during the recording of this podcast. A lot of times I just do straight one takes and boom, I'm done. But sometimes I like to make sure I'm saying certain things. And so I'll have to re-record several times. Well, as I was going back to audit and clean up and edit this podcast, I was cracking up at myself and laughing at myself throughout the whole thing as I listened to some of the screw ups. And so I thought for your entertainment, test. And on today's podcast, folks, I thought I would include the bloopers that developed as I was trying to record this particular podcast. A lot of times I just do one take and let it go. Testing. And on today's podcast, folks, I thought I would include the bloopers that developed during the recording of this podcast because oh man, I can't even re-record an intro to the blooper podcast. All right, here we go. And on today's podcast, no, that sucked. Okay, here we go. And on today's podcast, I thought I would include all the bloopers that developed during the recording of this episode called Why Employers Don't Give Feedback to Candidates. So if you can deal with the bloopers throughout the beginning of this, you'll hear my message at the end, and it should be rewarding to okay. All right. Hey, here's why employers don't give feedback to candidates, including the bloopers up front. Quite frankly, they aren't getting paid to give you professional coaching, right? The recruiter doesn't make money by giving you professional coaching necessarily, and the employer doesn't get paid for giving you. All right, test. Testing. And on today's podcast, I want to give you the cold hard facts on why you don't get any feedback about not getting the job, right? Why don't employers tell you what the specifics were around? Okay. Testing. And on today's podcast, why the employer or maybe even the recruiter doesn't tell you the reasons you didn't get the job, right? And on today's podcast, the cold hard facts on why the employer or maybe even the recruiter didn't give you the specifics around you not getting I got to say that. The summary for point number 3 there is the employer and the recruiter, they aren't being paid to give you professional job interviewing. Fuck. Okay. All right, testing. And on today's podcast, the cold hard facts, folks, around why the recruiter and or the employer didn't give you specifics. Testing. Being 5 points here I wanted to cover with you is you're not getting feedback a lot of times because the recruiters or the employees aren't getting God. All right. And finally, folks, here is the full-length, clean version of the episode. And on today's podcast, I want to tell you why employers and recruiters don't give you feedback if you're a rejected candidate for a job. Okay, we often get asked this question. Candidates will call and say, well, why wasn't I selected? Did the employer give you any feedback on why I didn't get the job? We get this question a lot. So I want to tell you there's 5 reasons why, at least as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure there's more than 5, but I'm going to share 5 with you today. Okay. And you're not going to like hearing them, by the way, if you're the candidate, but it's the reality. Here they are. Number 1, time. There's just not enough time in the day for the employers or the recruiters to type up a full-blown report on why you were rejected or why you didn't get the job. It's just a matter of time. Okay, number 1. Number 2, it's the legal concern, right? Most employers or recruiters are advised by counsel not to give you any specifics because nobody wants to get sued. Number 3, they just simply want to avoid difficult conversations. They want to avoid conflict, and they don't want to get into a debate with you about why you weren't selected. Okay. Number 4, they're not getting paid to give you professional coaching, right? The employer's not getting paid to do that. They're not making money by spending time with you to coach you on why you weren't selected. And a lot of times the recruiter isn't either. Now, the recruiter is paid by the company, not the candidate. However, the recruiter does benefit if the candidate is prepared for the interview. So a good recruiter that you've built a very strong relationship with, if they can give you some feedback, and if they were provided some feedback by the employer, they might be able to help and give you some coaching later because they're going to want to keep you as a candidate maybe for another job. But for the most part, remember, the employer and the recruiter, they aren't being paid to spend time giving you a bunch of professional coaching around job interviewing, not necessarily. And then the last one is point number 5, and this is really the biggest reason, okay? Point number 5 really dwarfs all the other reasons I just gave you. And here it is. There is no clear answer. The reason you're not getting feedback is because there isn't any specific feedback. There's no clear, specific one little point that you did wrong in the interview process. There's just no clear answer. They just liked somebody else better, or somebody else was just a little more qualified. And by the way, they're not going to spend time talking to you about why Johnny was more qualified than you. They're not going to tell you about Johnny's profile. Okay. So there's just not a clear answer most of the time. They liked Johnny better for whatever reason. They can't even put their finger on it. For example, here's how a lot of my conversations go. When employers call us to tell us what they think about a candidate that we've put in front of them, they'll often say, "Oh, I just loved Johnny. He was awesome." And I'll say, "Well, how come?" And, "Well, I don't know. He was just great." And same goes the other direction, right? I'll say, "Well, how'd Mary do?" And they'll go, "Well, Mary was okay. I just didn't like her that much." "Well, how come?" "I don't know. I just didn't get a good feel about her." My point is this. There's no specifics to give you, right? It's hard for the employer to put their finger on it because they just liked somebody else better or they thought somebody else was more qualified. So that's really the biggest reason right there that you're not getting specifics around why you were rejected or not selected for the job. And there is your Riderflex tip of the day. We truly hope you find our material helpful and entertaining. And in the spirit of giving back, Riderflex donates half of all proceeds gained from this podcast to the Volunteers of America and their efforts to support veterans with employment services. You can become a supporter of this podcast by listening on the platform Anchor FM. That's anchor.fm/Riderflex. You can send us your questions or suggested topics. Our email is podcast@riderflex.com, or drop us a voicemail at 888-964-5876. Visit riderflex.com to learn more about us. Thanks so much for listening, folks, and have a wonderful day.